Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's look into the documentation and the theoretical part of how to create physical standby database. Okay, we previously looked at the architecture of standby database. Okay, and how it is differentiated from the primary database and the normal database architecture. We looked at the process and other aspect of it. Now we will be looking at how to create the physical standby database. After this, we will be looking at the practical aspect. Okay, we will perform the activities. So let's get started. So what are the objectives? So objectives we are covering here is understanding the Oracle data guard requirements, plan for creating physical standby database, configure log archive dest and parameter, and creating a physical standby database. Okay. So what are the Oracle data guard requirements? So this has to be taken into consideration before moving on to perform the activities, actually installing the data guard and setting up the data guard. So the OS and the platform architecture must be same. Okay, that is the first thing. The second part is the hardware, CPU, memory size, storage size, configuration can be different. Okay, so let's say in physical primary database. Okay, in primary database, if the server is i7 and the standby database can be i5, kind of that. Okay, if you have one server with 16 gig of memory, other server can be 30 gig of memory, it makes no difference, you can install it. Okay, but the OS and the platform architecture must be same. It means that the operating system, if you have installed 7.7 Oracle Linux or normal Red Hat Linux, so both of them should be 7.7. And the platform architecture means if one is 64-bit, other must be 64-bit. The third part is the database release must be same. So I am currently using 12.2, okay, 0.0, 0.1. So I am using on both of them. Okay, it cannot be different. You cannot use 12.2 on one and another one will be 12.1. Okay, it is not possible. Now the primary database must run in archive log mode. Okay, this archive log is very important to ship the redo logs. Okay, as well. Other than that, now the database must operate in force logging mode. This is very important mode to enable, because there are some activities, okay, which can be performed in database using the no logging mode, okay, which is not allowed in data guard environment. If you do not set force logging mode, okay, like create table statement, just take an example. If you create a table, you can set up and create table and put the parameters and create table with no logging mode. Okay, developer usually use that option to create the table without impacting the performance on the database. But in data guard environment, because it relies on the redo shipping, okay, so the logging mode is very important. That's how the logs are generated and shipped to the primary and to the standby database. Sorry. Okay, so move on. What is about logging? Let's discuss about the logging operations. So that's what I was saying. Data guard relies on redo for synchronization. Thus, no logging and unrecoverable options should not be executed. Okay, so some of the options, some of the statements which has no logging options, like create an alter table, create an alter index, these two and others as well have an option where you can create a table with using the no logging. But in data guard environment, it is not allowed to. So to nullify this no logging option, you must use alter database force logging, and by using that, you are kind of overriding these option, and every statement which has been run which has no logging option, which will not be allowed. About standby redo log files used to store redo received from the another Oracle database. So usually these standby redo logs are generally used and are created. We will actually see how to create the standby redo log, because we have seen how the redo log files we can create, right? During the installation there are some redo log groups automatically created. After the installation you can actually check the $log file, right? And you can find out that what all redo log groups are there and what all redo log files are there. Okay, but in the standby environment, in data guard environment, you must have standby redo logs running there on the standby database. Okay, so these has to be created. They are structurally identical to the redo logs. Okay, and during the installation what happens that when you create the redo logs, there are some parameters which will multiplex these redo logs, but you don't want to have a multiplex redo logs and take up the space. You can actually delete the extra redo logs. Only one group is fine to be created. Okay, now the question comes is how many redo log files must be created on the standby database. So there is a calculation to it. So usually if there is a 3 redo log groups or 3 redo log files, okay, in a group, so let's say 3 groups which have one redo log file each in the group, then there will be +1 in the standby redo log. So when I'm saying primary database there is 3 redo log files, then in the standby there should be one more, right? 4 redo log files must be created. Now when we talk about this complete you see the calculation, this calculation comes from the rack data guard, where if you are setting up rack to rack data guard, then what you have to do, the numbers remain same. Okay, so you have to see the number of redo log groups, find out on the primary node. Okay, primary database, and then add 1 to it and then multiply by the maximum number of threads being the number of nodes. Okay, the instances. Now you can configure extra archiver process as well. So how do you create a standby redo log? Alter database, add standby log file. Okay, then the log file location and the size must be same as what you created on the primary database. Let's move on. Now let's talk about the log archive dest parameter. The log archive dest parameter is the most important parameter when you are setting up the Oracle data guard. Okay, you can actually set up 30 standby databases. Okay, and you can set up those standby databases in either async or sync. We have already discussed in the previous lecture about these two. Okay, now this log archive dest actually decides where these redo logs generated on the primary database will be sent to. Okay, so there are specific parameters, values you need to specify in the log archive dest while configuring the primary database and standby database. Okay, that's how you actually say that you will use this particular service and send the redo log to the standby database. Okay, so this is the most important parameter. You need to remember this. It has many parameters and attributes that control the data guard configuration. That's what I said earlier. Let's move on. Now these are the attributes, so let's go one by one. Okay, so you see the service attribute. This service attribute is actually TNS names descriptor. Okay, when you configure the primary and standby database, you will configure the TNS name and the TNS name alias for the standby database. The service value will be pointing to the standby database. Okay, so there will be TNS names, TNS name .aura file, and there will be values under it. Okay, for the standby database kind of. So you must have seen the TNS names.aura file. Okay, so service name will come from there. Now sync and async, as we all must be knowing about what is sync and async by its name as well as the previous lecture. If you can go through and watch that lecture. Sync is usually used for the synchronous redo transport, and async is used for asynchronous redo transport. In asynchronous, the standby database will not acknowledge, okay, to the primary database that it has received and saved the redo log files received from the primary database. Okay, that's how this is not the resource intensive operation. Okay, that's how you avoid much processing. Okay, and the data redo logs are immediately committed here. In the sync, the primary database will keep on waiting, and LNS in the primary database will keep looking and waiting for the standby to respond that it has received and saved the redo log files, and then LNS will provide this information to the primary database, and then the primary database will commit. Okay, so this takes a lot of resources. So we already know about sync and async. Now then, what is the net timeout? Net timeout is number of seconds the log writer process will wait. Okay, so net timeout is the number of seconds the log writer process will wait for an LNS process to respond before abandoning the standby as failed, because there are situations where there is a network issue, okay, and primary is not able to contact to the standby. So this particular parameter is used to make sure that primary actually waits for 30 seconds, which is default, and then abandon, saying that standby database is not available. Okay, and then what it will do, it will start running as a maximum performance, okay, mode, which we already discussed earlier. Usually please set up this to 15, and this is the good number, and which is set up in the real environment as well. And in net timeout requires a sync method, not async. Okay, reopen. So number of seconds before data get will allow the primary database to attempt a reconnection to the failed standby. So these two are kind of together. So this one actually says that, okay, I will wait. Primary database will say that I will wait for 15 seconds when you set it to 15, or I rather leave it to 30 seconds. It will wait for 15 seconds and then it will abandon. Now you don't want that to immediately abandon it and then start running as a maximum performance mode, right? You want primary database to retry connecting, right? Because there are chances where there is a network lag or network went away and then comes back immediately, right? It is fixed somehow. Then what you need to do, you need to set up the reopen parameter as well. So what will happen is, as soon as this connection is lost, in default is 300 seconds. In 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes, in 5 minutes primary database will retry to connect to the standby database. Okay, usually you should set it to 15 to 30. Okay, you don't want to wait that much longer, because the application and the objects and as well as the data is very critical, right? You don't want to lose that particular 5 minutes. So as soon as something is lost, right, primary database will try to reconnect in 15 to 30 seconds. Don't never set it to 300 seconds, which is a big number. Let's move on. Now the firm and affirm is the same thing. Affirm is usually used in sync and no affirm is used in async. Affirm and no affirm is mutually exclusive. By means of it is, you cannot use these two values together. Either you use affirm or you use no affirm. So what happens here, the redo transport service in the primary database waits for the acknowledgement from the destination that the redo has received and returned to the standby redo logs. Okay, so it requires a service attribute. That's what we discussed during the sync operation. So in the sync operation, we already know that redo transport service will in the primary database will wait, right, for the acknowledgement that everything is written and saved into the standby redo logs. But in no affirm, when you set it to no affirm and that too with async, right, the redo transport service in the primary database wait for the acknowledgement from the destination that the redo has been received, but it will not wait for that to save, right? It will immediately commit. That is no affirm. So the default for sync is affirm, default for async is no affirm. Now comes important parameters. DB unique name. This DB unique name must be the standby database name where the logs has to be sent to the redo logs. Now the valid for, this is very important parameter. This will actually specify whether the redo log data will be written or sent to the destination. Okay, so this will define that if this particular location, whatever location log archive dest you will set up, this particular log archive destination will be used to either send or save the redo logs. Okay, so the types of archiving, these are the values. So type of archiving files and role of the database, and these two have to be together. Okay, you choose one of this and one of this, that's how you make a pair. So online log file is the value, standby log file is the value, and all log file is the value. What all files you want to archive, that's what you specify. And the role, what is the role of the current database, primary role, standby role, and it is working as all roles. So let's take an example. If you're taking online log file, okay, and you're taking primary role, then it means that if I am a primary database, okay, let's say you are specifying this particular parameter in the primary database, it means that that particular log archive destination will be used to just send the redo logs. But when there is a role transition later, right, during the failover and switch over, that particular destination will not be used to send the redo logs because you are currently now standby, right, after the failover or switchover. That's what I'm trying to specify. So here if I say that log archive dash 2 has been set up and the service is standby, okay, which is where you want to send the redo logs, and these two parameters we already know, we don't want to discuss anymore. Valid for, it means that I am saving on, I am currently primary in working as a primary role, okay, and I am storing the online log files, right? So when I am these two particular pair, means I am behaving as a primary role and I am saving the online log files. If these two are correct, right, please send the redo logs to the standby redo logs. Okay, but when the switchover happens, now I will not be in any more primary role, right? I will be behaving as a standby. So don't use this log archive dash 2. Hope I made it clear. Okay, now here comes one more important parameter, log archive config. This particular parameter will specify, okay, that what all databases are participating in the data guard setup. So there I am using primary and standby database. Okay, so my database is database and host name as well is primary and standby. That's what I am using. Now there are steps to create a physical standby databases. Okay, there are different stages. So in a particular project, right, let's say you are in a team who is planning to implement this critical project of implementing this data guard. Okay, so what will go through in implementation of setting up a data guard environment? So when it comes to that, there is important aspect. There is planning and there is execution. Planning comes to decide on data guard requirement configuration, right? Why the data guard configuration is requirement? Because it has what do you call that, it will give you a visibility or a practicality or list of things required to set up, or list of resources required, right, to set up for that specific data guard setup. So what I mean to say is, let's say if you are planning for a maximum performance, right? Now as you know that maximum performance have a chances of losing the data, so you would like to have another data guard and data standby database setup, right? So in a maximum protection mode or maximum availability mode, so you need more resources. Now let's say you are setting them in a maximum availability mode, right? Then you might not lose the data, but there are chances where there can be network timeout or something and database can hang, right? Then you might set up one more server with maximum protection. So It all depends on what you are setting up and what parameters you want to use. You discuss this with your management, and that's how you come up with the idea. Okay, so decide on the data guard requirement configuration, decide on the required hardware and network connection. That's what I was saying. Now the execution part. Whatever planning you have done, you have to implement that particular part, discuss with your DBA team and manager, and then discuss that. What goes through the planning stage? That's what I was actually discussing. There is RPO and there is RTO, the recovery point objective, and there is recovery time objective. What do you mean by these two? You need to make sure that you remember these two, right? So there can be interview questions discussing about what is RPO and what is RTO. So RPO means how much data you are willing to lose when the failure occurs. Okay, because in maximum performance you might lose some data because the primary database is not waiting for acknowledgement from standby database, right? It will immediately commit the record. So you don't even know, and you don't even wait for something which had to be saved in the standby database, right? Which is called standby database. You are not waiting, you are just optimistic about if it is saved or not, right? So you need to make sure that you need to discuss this RPO, okay, and make sure that you have a backup of something about RPO, right? Because eventually, immediately, if one day standby database or the primary database is gone, right, now everything is switched to the standby database. Now the old standby becomes new primary. Do you have the capability to roll back or roll forward the operations? Do you have the backup of everything what was there in the primary? Okay, so you need to make sure you are willing to lose some data. Okay, in the recovery time objective is how long should it take for the database to be up and running after the failure. Okay, so you need to also make sure that you need to take these into consideration, right? You don't want longer time to for the recovery time objective, right, for database to be up and running. I hope everyone is understanding. Now planning stage, based on RPO and RPO, RTO and RPO, you take the decision on the following with your management, right? What protection mode you will be using, how much should be the bandwidth and the latency of the network. Okay, it is according to the setting, maximum performance, maximum protection, maximum availability. Okay, that's what you are using. Synchronous, asynchronous, what hardware specification you will be using. Okay, you need to take into consideration. Or should you be considering a fast start failover, because eventually if the primary fails and now the old standby becomes new primary, you want the old primary, right, to be immediately up and running. That is what fast start failover is used for. So do you want to configure that or not? Now the execution stage, right? These are also needed to be discussed, as we already discussed about two stages, planning and execution. Execution stage is also very important. You want to decide which management interface you want to be using. Are you already comfortable with SQL Plus? Do you want to configure Data Guard Broker? Do you have Oracle Enterprise Manager, Cloud Control? So all these are the management interface. Which one you want to use? So you need to decide about that. Okay, because either you can use SQL Plus or you can use Data Guard Broker. You cannot use both of them. Okay, you need to turn off one to use the another one. Now you have to decide either though your DBS will be using sysdg privilege on the user, or they will be using sysdba privilege. Okay, this is very important in aspect to the security, right? Who is using what, because sysdg will give you capability to perform actions on the data guard environment, but it will not give you a complete access to the sys schema, right? Kind of, superpower access. But sysdba will give you everything, right? It is a very dangerous access to be given to the even to the dbs, right? You don't want junior dbs to have sysdba privilege. So that's what I'm trying to say. So you need to decide on that. And one more important thing is sysdg privilege is available 12c and later. It was not available prior to 12c. Preparing the standby for creating the prepare the primary database for creating the standby database. Okay, you need to prepare for that. Prepare the standby database system. So you have to prepare both of them. Create the physical standby eventually. Now let's see the three stages. Okay, three stages. Prepare the primary database, prepare the standby database, and eventually create the physical standby database. So what goes into the preparing the primary database? You need to enable the archiving mode, which is very important. You need to configure archive log deletion policy in rman. Okay, you need to make sure you configure this, because why it is needed, because you do not want uh, logs to be filled up, right? The older logs to be keep filling up, right? So for that reason you need to have a policy around it, right? Which one you want to delete, the older ones, right? The obsolete ones. Enable the force logging, we already discussed about it. Configure the standby redo logs. Usually Oracle recommends that standby redo logs should be configured on both the servers, whoever is participating, either it is primary or it is standby or standbys. Okay, multiple standbys. Okay, so it should be configured on both of them, so that eventually if one of them fails, or if primary fails, there will be switch over and fail over, right? So you want primary to become standby and standby to become primary. Set the related primary database initialization parameters. Okay, you have to set up the parameters, and you need to enable the flashback database, so that when primary fails, okay, because the transaction is still going on, you know, the application is still connected, you want immediately everyone, so application to be failed over to the standby database, the new primary. But there are transactions which are failed, okay, which are still in the current redo logs, or in the memory. You want those ones to be rolled back, which are not committed yet. Okay, so flashback database is very important, otherwise the data, you will see a lot of corruptions. You need to set up the control file record keep time. Usually it is 90. You need to make sure it goes to 300. Configure the tnsnames.aura file, which is very important, so that the primary and the standby databases can see each other, connect to each other during the arm and duplication. Create the password file if it is not there. Usually there is, okay, during the primary database creation. So don't need to worry about but in the during the arman duplication, the password file will not be copied. So you need to make sure before running the arman duplication, because arman duplication uses the sys user, right? So just copy the password file from primary to the standby and rename the password file. So these are the initialization parameters. DB unique name we already discussed. Log archive config, which are the databases which are participating in the data guard setup. Okay, this log archive dash 2 we already talked about. Remote login file password file will be exclusive. Okay, file server, we will discuss about this later during the setup. Standby file management must be auto, and DB file name convert parameter to be should be set up, but it is not must. If the directory structure of primary and standby is same for the data file location and for the redo log location, then you don't need to set up the db file name convert. And if omf is set up, then you don't need to worry about the db file name convert. But if the primary database file location and as well as the standby database directory structure is completely different, and you want the data files and redo logs to be stored in the different architecture on the different directory structure, then you need to make sure to configure the db file name convert parameter. Okay, let's move on. Preparing the standby database. Now you need to create the required directories. These directories are the a dump and b dump, okay, core dump destinations. Those ones have to be created, okay, on the os level. You need to create the init and the sid.aura file, and you need to put only one parameter into it, which is db name, okay, which should point to the primary database itself. Okay, now when you do that and start up the database and run the arman duplication, the rman will actually back up the primary sp file, change the name and do all the things. Okay, so you don't need to worry about it. It will restore and recover. Copy the password file from primary system. Okay, we already discussed about this. You need to configure the tnames.names.aura file in both the location. Okay, and you need to create the static listener entry for the standby database. Okay, so for our standby database, you need to turn off the dynamic listener and you have to create a static listener and startup. Okay, so that is done. Now this is the final thing, how to create a standby from active database. You need to run this command: duplicate target database for standby from active database. Okay, active database being the primary database. Okay, it will automatically duplicate, it will run, it will do everything. It will copy the file from primary, it will store into standby, it will recover, store and recover those files, and the database, it will start the instances. That's what it will do. You will eventually see that the database has come up. Okay, it just takes around 5 minutes and everything works. Now creating the standby database, what you need to do in creation of standby database, after the rman duplication everything is done, right? You need to go to the SQL prompt and you have to run this alter database recover manage standby database disconnect, and running this will start the redo apply. Okay, so redo apply means mrp process. Okay, so now you need to perform the post creation step. You need, if you want, you can upgrade the protection mode from maximum perform, because the default is the maximum performance. You can upgrade it to maximum availability or the maximum protection. Okay, you can enable the flashback database option as well. So I hope everyone enjoyed this lecture. We have completed these part. We have defined the Oracle data guard requirements. We have discussed about log archive and dest and parameter in great length. Okay, we have looked into perform the procedure of creating the physical standby database step by step. Hope everyone enjoyed this lecture. Please like, please subscribe, and please share my channel with friends and relatives. Okay, thank you very much for watching.